Hey, how's it going? And today I just wanted to talk about the true nature of the Blueprint interface, and I wanted to do this to correct the record for some past tutorials that I have made on this topic. So this is my most recent word about the Blueprint interface. So as we're going through this, I want you to think about what good is a function with no input or outputs. Like if there's a person and they're listening to you and they take your input and then they don't do anything after you've told them to do some, what good is that? How good is that? So you may come to realize that a function with no outputs is essentially worthless. And ironically, that's what the purpose of a Blueprint interface is. A lot of times we use it and it has a function in it, but we don't have any inputs or outputs on it. And we use it primarily for communication, one-way communication, but that's not really the true purpose of what the interface is for. So just some key points real fast about the interface. It's available project-wide. It's used primarily, the way I see it used, and the way I've used it mostly, is for one-way communication among blueprints, but that's not its primary function, pun intended, I guess. It's made for ensuring standardization for shared functions. And it can be thought of as a contract ensuring that classes are using the same function name with the same inputs and outputs, but the individual throughput of the function is up to the classes that are implementing the interface. I know that sounds pretty abstract right now, and that's one reason actually you may not even ever have a need to use a Blueprint interface to its true potential, because that's exactly what it's for, is ensuring the standardization among shared functions. Functions are a lot like people. They can take input and output, but they don't have to do anything. They don't have to listen to your input, and they don't have to take your output or put out any output. And the last thing to point, once you create a function in any Blueprint class, you can call that function from any other Blueprint, and you don't need an interface to do that. So when you think about interface, just think about it as a way of ensuring that functions are meeting certain requirements when they're used by multiple classes. And again, for that reason, you may never ever need to use a Blueprint interface for its true potential. You may just simply use it for communicating one blueprint to another. So anyway, let me give you a working example of this, and I've tried to make this as simple as I possibly can. So we're going to create 3 Blueprint classes and 1 interface. And let's start by making the interface. So I'm going to right click and go to Blueprint here and go to Blueprint interface, and I'll call it my interface. And we're going to put 2 functions in here and dock it up top here. And now by default it comes in, you'll notice, with a function ready to go. But this function can take inputs or outputs, but you don't need any inputs or outputs to be able to have one blueprint communicate to another and trigger an event. So I'm going to actually just call this, I'll press F2, and I'm going to call this event triggering function. But I don't really think it's a true function because it doesn't have any inputs or outputs. If it is a function, it's pretty worthless. The only thing that it's really good for is notifying that it's been called. But this isn't really a function, even though it's under functions. It doesn't do anything. There's no inputs or outputs. Now let's go ahead and create another function, and I'm going to call this true function. And why am I calling this true function? Because this one is going to take input. In fact, I'm going to call this here input, and we'll make it an integer so that we can do something to it if we want. And we'll click here to create an output. And interestingly, this gives us a visual representation of what a interface is in object-oriented programming. So this is essentially what they call the contract, so that any class that implements this interface is agreeing that this function is going to be called true function, and it's going to have an input called input of an integer type, and it's going to have an output of an integer type. And that's the contract that the classes are agreeing to when they implement this interface. So I know that no matter where I call this interface from, and no matter what class is calling it, I know that its output is always going to be of an integer type, and it's going to be called true function. But notice here, there is no implementation of this function. So even though we've created like the shell of the function, and everyone's going to agree to this shell. There's nothing inside of it. The implementation of the function is left up to the individual classes that are going to implement this interface. So, and this function doesn't do anything. This one here, if I double click it, there is no input or outputs. It's just a call. We can call this and communicate by way of a call, but that's all we can do with this. It's not really doing anything. Okay, so now we're coming here and there's our interface. That's great. So next, we're going to create 3 Blueprint classes. The first one, I'll come up here to Blueprint class and we'll go to actor, and I'm just going to call this sender. And this is just how we're going to interact with the other 2 blueprints. So I'm going to double click into this. And if I come to the event graph, well, before I do that, let's go ahead and create the other 2 blueprints. So we're going to create, let me come up here and I'll go Blueprint class, actor, and I'll call this one receiver 1. And I'll create 2 of them so you can see this implemented in multiple interfaces. So I'm going to right click and create one more, and we'll call this receiver 2. Okay, and then we'll click into this blueprint, the sender here. And what we need, one thing that we're going to need is we're going to need a reference to those 2 blueprint interfaces, because otherwise, even though we have an interface, I have no way of targeting them or reaching them. So here what I'm going to do is I'm going to go get actor of class here, and I'll duplicate this. I'll hit Control D, and then here we'll get receiver 1, and we need this reference, and you'll see why in a minute here. There should be here receiver 1, and here this should be receiver 2. And we could promote these 2 variables if we wanted to, but I'm not going to do that because we have the reference right here. Okay, and then I'm going to create a keyboard press, keyboard 1. Maybe I'll create a couple of keyboard presses here. So then I'll do keyboard 2, because we're going to be doing some different stuff here. And let's do, because I want you to see this fully operational. Keyboard 3, and then let's do keyboard 4. What we're going to do is we're going to call the interface, right? So we don't need to implement the interface on this side because we're just on the sending side. We only need to implement interfaces on the receiving side. So here what I'm going to do is, remember we created those 2 functions, right? And the first one was called event triggering, is event triggering function here. See that? And I can hit Control D to copy that. If I plug this in here, I'm going to get a little messy with my wires here. So notice we can call the function that we created, the so-called function that we created in that interface, but there's no inputs or outputs. So what I can do here is I'm going to plug this into here, and I'm going to plug this one into here. So now we have a target. And if I compile that, we don't get any errors. Now we also created another function, and so if I right click here and go look for true function, it's right here too. But notice the difference is it's got input. It will accept an input, and it does give an output, but there's no, I can't really affect the output of it. But here's what I was talking earlier about. Functions are like people. We can give them input, but they don't necessarily have to do anything with the input. So for receiver 1 here, I've got this one here. I'm going to go ahead and plug this into here. So for receiver 1, I'm going to give it an input of, let's say, 10, right? But that doesn't mean that that function has to do anything with that input. Then I'm going to go ahead and hit Control D and copy this one here too. Whoops. And this one, let's say I'll give it an input of 20. Okay. And then this one needs to be targeted here. I know I'm making a mess with these wires. I usually wouldn't be that messy. But anyway, so you see what we've got going on here. This is our event triggering function. No inputs or outputs. It doesn't really do anything. In my mind, it's not really even a function. It's like calling having a car seat on the road and then calling it a car, because it doesn't have all the components it needs to be in. Now, this would be a true function because it has inputs and outputs, but it's going to be up to the individual classes to implement those, and you'll see that in just a minute here. So we're going to compile and save all this. Oh, one more thing I need to do, sorry, I forgot, is I need to come up here and come down here and enable input so that I can actually press the keyboards and then just drag that into the scene. Now let's go into the main part of this. So now we have this blueprint class. It's called receiver. It doesn't do really anything, but we can implement that our interface now. So if I come up here to class settings and I go to inherited interfaces here, and I go to my interface, I can search for it right here. Now I've implemented that interface, and you'll see that we have the two functions that we created. Now notice the color difference. If it's yellow here, to me, what that means is that there's no output on it. It's not a true function. It's just for messaging. And if it's gray or just not any other really color, I don't know what you would call that, white or gray, that means it's a true function and it has an input and output. And there's going to be a difference when I click on these two. So when I click on this is because it's that color. It's truly just going to be an event. It's going to be just a function call. So see, and here, when I press 1, I can just print a string here to say hello or something, right? Okay. Now when I click this one, you'll see it's a function. And now I can do anything I want with the throughput. Now when I press 2, it's going to send me a 10, but I don't have to do anything with that 10. I could do something with it if I wanted to take it, but let's say I don't even care that you're sending me a 10, and I'm going to send out a, let's say 101. That's the output. You can send me whatever you want. I don't have to do anything with it if I don't, but I'm going to return 101. So if I come back to my sender here, right, and it has an output print string, and plop that in there, it's going to say 101, right? So this will print a string of 101. So it's going to return me back an output, right, when I've called that interface. So I'm kind of taking advantage of whatever the throughput is on that particular blueprint class. Now let's come over to this other receiver. Oh, and I also need to drag it into the scene, by the way. And then here, I'm going to click into this one, and we're going to do the same thing. We come to class settings, and we're going to implement the interface. So it's my interface here, like that. And again, this one event triggering function, I can double click it, and I can just print out another string. I can type something different from hello. I can say receiver 2 has been called. There's that. Now if I double click this, there's that function again that the sender can now have the results of, right? So here, let's say, did I send it something the second time? Okay, so I'm going to send it 20, right? So I could take that input of 20 here and go, let's say, add operator. And let's say I'm going to add 20 to it, or maybe I'll say 40. And now it's going to send back to the caller the output. So if I come back to sender here, I can pull, I have this output, and it should be, well, I need to print my string. Let me duplicate this. Control D. And now if we plug this in, this should return us 40. And so I hope this kind of gives you an idea of what's going on. It is confusing because this idea of what a function is, I think understanding what a function is will help you, because if you look at what the interface is, it starts by default with the function. But one function, the initial function, is just for triggering a call that can trigger an event, as we've seen over here. One can trigger an event, the other one can return us an output based on whatever the throughput is of the class it called. So I know that seems like a lot. So what should we expect to see? Oh, and I need to drag this one onto the scene too. So what should we expect to see if I come in here? So what we're going to do is we're going to call receiver 1, and receiver 1 is going to print hello. Then we're going to press 2, and we're going to send it a 10, but it doesn't matter what I send it because it doesn't have to do anything with my input, and it's going to return 101. So we're going to see hello and 101. And then we come over here, we're going to call receiver 2, and it's going to print out receiver 2 has been called. And then we're going to go to sender, and we're going to send it, this time we're going to send it some input to the function here, true function, and it's going to add 40 to it, and it's going to return 60. So then this is going to print out 60. So we should see receiver 2 has been called and 60. And it's only going to be on the screen for a second. So let's see if that's what we see. Hit print, and I'm going to hit 1, and it should say hello. Hello. And I hit 2, and it should say 101. And then I'm going to hit 3, and it's going to say receiver 2 has been called. And I'm going to hit 4, and it's going to say 60. So anyway, I hope you found this of some help. It took me a while to get my mind around all this. And what really helped me was learning to code in Verse, because they do use interfaces in Verse code. In fact, I'll leave a link to that tutorial in the description. So anyway, take care, have a great day, and I'll talk to you next time.